What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Although nerfs in Hearthstone are definitely more common than buffs, the alpha and beta particularly were full of just insane card changes, a lot of which actually were buffs. Any card changes, whether buffs or nerfs, definitely changed the game a ton. So today we wanted to take a look back into the history books and talk about some of the biggest buffs that ever took place in Hearthstone history. And if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button, and if you don't enjoy the video, feel free to hit that dislike button too, and let's get started. So first up we have Frostbolt and Fireball at number 10, which we're actually grouping together since the buffs were pretty much identical. So Fireball originally cost 5 mana, but was reduced to only costing 4 mana in one of the early alpha patches. Frostbolt originally cost 3 mana, but was changed to only costing 2 mana in one of the closed beta patches. Now a 1 mana reduction on each card might not necessarily seem like a huge change, but this was definitely one of the most important buffs in Hearthstone ever. There's no way iconic and extremely relevant decks like Freeze Mage or Tempo Mage would really be able to function at all with more expensive burst cards. Tempo Mage just wouldn't be efficient enough, and Freeze Mage's ability to burst damage and control the board would take just such a massive hit. In a way, the entire mage class as a whole is sort of built around its strong burst damage spells, and the buff that made those spells good changed the future of the mage class and the entire history of the game really. Next up at number 9 we have Leper Gnome. Now this one's actually pretty interesting to take a look at because Leper Gnome originally started out as a 1/1 creature, which was later buffed to a 2/1 creature in the alpha phase, and then multiple years later that buff was reverted back to a 1/1 creature recently. And this means that we don't really have to do all that much speculation or analysis, since we can kind of just look at the card before the patch and after. Before the patch, Leper Gnome was just this insanely powerful aggro card that was both a great play on turn 1 and a source of some awesome extra damage later on in the game, and after it was nerfed to a 1/1 creature, it's been completely unplayed. And that says a lot about the alpha buff that turned it into a 2/1 originally, since this buff pretty much let aggro and face decks flourish in Hearthstone for an extremely long time. Leper Gnome was a staple in every face deck, as well as in a lot of aggro decks like Undertaker Hunter and all sorts of stuff, and those decks probably wouldn't have been nearly as strong, certainly wouldn't have been as meta defining with a much weaker version of one of the best 1-drops, and so Leper Gnome's buff in the alpha definitely changed the course of the game quite a bit. Next up at number 8 we have the buff to Mana Wyrm. Until it was buffed to its current version in an early alpha patch, Mana Wyrm actually originally started out as a 0/3 1-mana creature. Now again, that 1 point of stat might not seem all that much like a huge deal, but it definitely was, because starting out as a 0/3 meant that Mana Wyrm was pretty much useless until you started casting spells. It would die super easily to trades with other early game minions, which often meant that you would just have to keep the Mana Wyrm in your hand until you could cast the spells on the same turn, which mean you just weren't using your mana efficiently and just really slowed down so many aggressive openers from the mage class. Imagine if Tunnel Trog was a 0/3 creature, it would be so much worse, probably wouldn't even see play in mid-range Shaman. Being a 1/3, starting out with that 1 point of attack is huge for cards like Mana Wyrm and Tunnel Trog, since 1/3 creatures are already pretty solid stats for a 1-drop honestly, and they start to grow super quickly. Next up at number 7 we have a buff to Cabal Shadow Priest. So Cabal used to be a 3/4 creature with the exact same effect until it was buffed in the closed beta to being a 4/5 creature. Now this is a really big change for the card, since when it was a 3/4 you really just weren't getting all that much value at all, even if you stole something really awesome. A 4/5 is just so much better than a 3/4 for so many reasons, and Cabal being buffed to those stats meant that it became a great card for Priest to play for a very long time. Although Cabal Shadow Priest has gotten a little bit phased out of play recently, since most priests are dragon decks nowadays and Shrinkmeister isn't in the game anymore, we definitely wouldn't be surprised to see it come back at some point, because in the past it was just such an awesome card. Moving on to number 6, we have Starving Buzzard. So a lot of people probably don't know that before all of the nerfs that Starving Buzzard got, it actually got a massive buff, which, to be honest, we gotta admit, probably caused all of the nerfs in the first place. So the original Starving Buzzard was a 2/2 creature for 2 mana with the wording, whenever you play a beast, draw a card. In an early alpha patch, however, Blizzard changed Buzzard's wording to say summon rather than play, which meant that while previously Starving Buzzard only activated on minions that you played as a card from your hand, but now instead it would activate on things like Unleash the Hound, Savannah Highmane Dying, Animal Companion, etc. And this buff is really what broke Starving Buzzard, since it went from being a decent value minion that maybe drew you 1 card or 2, or maybe even 0 if it died pretty quickly, to just being the best engine card in the entire game's history. This buff is what ultimately forced all of the Buzzard nerfs, and it would have been really cool to see how the game progressed if it had never happened. Up next at number 5 we have the buff to Power Word Shield. Now this one's a little bit interesting to look at, since a lot of people, maybe you don't necessarily see Power Word Shield as a great card, but the current version of it enables so much stuff in the Priest class and is just really amazing in terms of reliability and versatility. And when you compare it to the original card, we can definitely start to see how big of a buff that this really was. The original Power Word Shield gave a minion +3 health for just 1 mana. That's it actually, that's all it did. A Blessing of Might that hit health instead didn't actually draw cards, so this is a card that probably wouldn't have been played all that often, except in maybe really dedicated Divine Spirit decks or some sort of like weird combos. Instead, we got a card that's pretty much a 2-of include in really just every Priest deck ever, which is how big of a buff that this card really was. You know, Power Word Shield now, drawing a card made it so that it just wasn't a waste of a card. You know, it became a way to thin out your deck, find the cards you need, while also having really good synergy with just everything. And it became such an awesome tool for the Priest class in general. Next up on the list, we have another Priest card, which is Northshire Cleric at number 4. Up until a closed beta patch that turned Northshire Cleric into the same card it is today, Northshire Cleric actually used to cost 2 mana originally. Now we've already talked about what a massive difference 1 mana can make, and Northshire Cleric's definitely not an exception whatsoever. You know, Cleric costing 1 mana lets Priest have a really awesome 1-drop with a beneficial effect that's good at any stage of the game. While a 2 mana Northshires may be okay and potentially still playable in decks that want Northshire Cleric, a 1 mana Northshire is just so insane against aggro and just enables a ton of really awesome things, and this buff gave Priest the early game that it really needed to be competitive, and it's definitely something that had a huge impact on the class overall. Next up at number 3 we have the buff to Bane of Doom, which is probably one of the coolest buffs that ever existed in Hearthstone. So despite saying summon a random demon, Bane of Doom used to only actually be able to summon from a very select few list of demons, of which were Blood Imp, Voidwalker, Flame Imp, Dread Infernal, Succubus, and Felguard. And since half of the summonable demons at the time were 1-drops, the average stat distribution on the demon that you would get was pretty awful on average, and you couldn't really even get anything that insane honestly, since the best demon ever available was just a vanilla 6/6 creature. But later on in a patch, Blizzard made it so that you could get any collectible demon from Bane of Doom, which meant that the card can now get some crazy stuff like Jiraxxus, Mal'Ganis, Doomguard, and create some really insane scenarios. It actually saw a lot of play in both Zoo Lock and Reno Lock and Hand Lock as well, or some variants of it for quite a while, but has since fallen out of favor a little bit. Still though, Blizzard took just such a terrible card everyone was annoyed with and made it super awesome and really playable. So this was both a super important buff and a sign that Blizzard won't completely neglect all terrible cards in the future. And moving on to number 2, we have a buff to Knife Juggler. So the first change to Juggler is actually quite similar to what originally happened to the Starving Buzzard change. So originally Knife Juggler only procced on minions that you played from your hand, but the wording was changed to summon so that it would proc on things like Unleash the Hounds, Implosion, Death Rattles, just everything really. And this was just such a huge buff that made Knife Juggler the card that it is today, especially in both Hunter and Zoo decks. And on this same patch actually, Knife Juggler's stats were changed from being a 2/3 to a 3/2 creature. Now this wasn't exactly a buff on paper, but it made the card stronger in face decks since it had more attack in general, and just let it be so much more annoying and contest those 1-drops like Northshire Cleric, and really just be so much more powerful for aggressive decks, which is what you wanted to play Knife Juggler in anyway. And the combination of triggering off a ton of different stuff and the more aggressive stats made Knife Juggler just this insane aggro card for a really long time, and it still sees play after being nerfed. And our last card on the list, taking home the number 1 spot, is Unleash the Hounds, and for actually a very good reason. So after Blizzard nerfed the really OP version of Unleash, the one that gave all your beasts +1 attack and charge, they changed it to a 4 mana spell that summons a hound for each enemy minion. Now 4 mana was definitely a bit of an overreaction on Blizzard's part, especially considering how balanced the card currently is at 3 mana, But after the initial nerf, Blizzard had decided that they nerfed it a little bit too hard, and so they buffed it to being a 2-mana spell. Now 2-mana Unleash is obviously just so insane, especially when you consider the fact that 2-mana Buzzard existed at the same time, as did the 3/2 Knife Juggler, and the meta just had tons of decks that wanted to play for the board, so 2-mana Unleash quickly became one of the most overpowered cards in Hearthstone history. And when you consider how awful a 4-mana Unleash is, it's easy to see why that buff to Unleash was definitely the biggest of all time. Of course, it was soon nerfed to the 3-mana version that we have today, but overpowered cards can never last. So that just about wraps up our list, our take on Hearthstone's biggest buffs ever. Definitely let us know what you think the biggest buffs in the game were in the comments section below, and looks like that's gonna be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.